Evening, guys. We'll get started with your review session, and it looks like we don't have very many questions we need to wrestle with tonight. So we'll get started right away. If you do have any questions, feel free to post, and then also tomorrow, if you find that you've got any things that pop up that are causing you problems, we can definitely deal with them when you come to class as well. So to get started, we'll take a look at what period two's got going on. And I thought I had that open, but I must have closed it out. So let's get started with that. And I'll backtrack through classes again, as usual, so that if there is anybody who posts after we get through your class, I'll definitely round back so we're able to take a look at that for you. So the first question I've got for period two is coming from Neil, and the question is, can I go over vertical integrations and trusts? And vertical integrations are pretty simple to understand from the standpoint that if you take a chart like this, and like we talked about in class, if these are all gas stations that are in existence, this is essentially what a horizontal monopoly would look like, where if you're trying to buy up all the gas stations in a town, you would own all the gas stations, and that would be all that you would own. The thing to keep in mind, though, is think about what you did with your Steel Empire game. As soon as you start going vertical and you start buying up all the things that go into making your product, kind of like you did with buying coal mines and coke ovens and that sort of stuff for Steel Empire, you're then creating a vertical monopoly where you're buying up all the products going into your monopoly. And since you don't need to buy them from anybody, they're going to be cheaper, and so that's going to make your monopoly more profitable for you. So remember, when we talk about these monopolies, horizontal monopolies like this one is going to be what Rockefeller is doing when he buys up oil refineries. Meanwhile, vertical monopolies going upwards is what Carnegie does, where he buys up like iron mines up in the Iron Range, railroad tracks, boats, steel mills, and whatever in Pittsburgh, so he can own the whole process by himself. Neil's other question has to do with trusts. And when it comes to trusts, the way to picture a trust company is strictly the idea that for John D. Rockefeller, he is trying to figure out how to make sure that he is not going to get hurt for his monopoly business, where he is going to own a monopoly that looks like this, but there's a bunch of regulation coming in the late 1800s to try to bust up monopolies like these. So what he is going to do, like we talked about in class, is he is going to build a gigantic trust company that is going to become the technical owner of all of his monopolies, and he will become the majority owner of that one company. And so that trust company will technically own the entire monopoly. And because of its legal organization and the fact that it's owned by Rockefeller and shareholders, it's going to not meet the technical definition of what a monopoly is. And that's going to keep Rockefeller then safe from having anti-monopoly legislation affecting his business. So hopefully that explains what's going on with vertical integrations and trusts. If you have any other questions, feel free to post so I can help you out. Trent's got a question about muckrakers. And the simple way to imagine a muckraker is you've got people in the late 1800s who are writing magazine articles and books, like Frank Norris that is mentioned inside your textbook, who are writing articles that are examining what sort of things are going on that are corrupt in the late 1800s. So we're going to learn about a woman named Ida Tarbell, who is going to be writing articles about how bad Standard Oil's monopoly is. And we'll also be learning about a muckraker named Upton Sinclair, who will be writing about how evil the meatpacking industry is and how nasty it is, the stuff that people are eating at that time. So what muckrakers are doing is they're raking through the muck and corruption of society, and then they're exposing that to everybody in the hope that the readers will then put pressure on politicians to make change happen. And we'll definitely see that happening then a few chapters from now when we start learning about the progressive era of Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, when they actually start changing a lot of the things that are corrupt about the Gilded Age. So let me see, I've got no other questions in period two currently, so let me flip to period four. Sam, hopefully what I showed about a trust is good for you. The second question that you've got is explaining what the gospel of wealth means. So very simply, the way to think about the gospel of wealth is think about the idea that's coming in the late 1800s, where wealthy people are believing that they're better than other people. They're believing in social Darwinism and class structures. And so they're coming to believe that if you are wealthy, dying wealthy is something that most people think is their goal, but you're going to find Andrew Carnegie is the person who's going to argue for a gospel of wealth. And what he says is that it's your duty, if you're wealthy, to do something to advance civilization as a monument to your life. And instead of doing things like just buying like food for poor people or clothing that is disposable, they believe in building instead ladders of opportunity where you'll be able to move up into the upper class of society, because you could possibly take advantage of like using a library or go to a college or go to an opera. And all those opportunities would give somebody the opportunity to become wealthy, especially if they are also destined to be wealthy because they're genetically predisposed to being like that. And for Andrew Carnegie especially, having been a poor immigrant working his way up through a railroad first before he then moved on to steel, he feels very sympathetic to giving other people opportunities like that. Anna's got a question about why did Grover Cleveland argue for a lower tariff? Grover Cleveland in the late 1800s is somebody who, he's our only Democrat elected in the late 1800s, and he's not that much different from the Republicans in that he is laissez-faire, hands-off business, but he is responsive to groups of people like farmers, and the farmers are not doing well with the high tariffs of the time period, because the way to picture a tariff is, imagine this is the United States and this is Europe. If the United States throws up a gigantic tax a boundary around it, making everything that goes into the country higher priced because of taxes, other countries will do the same to our products. And so what farmers are wrestling with is when they're buying stuff from businesses in the country, they can either buy from rich monopolies or nobody, because tariffs are making prices super high. And then when farmers try to send their stuff from America over to Europe, they're going to run into tariffs where they're already getting bad prices for their food, and they get worse with the tariffs that are being imposed during that time period. So Grover Cleveland is going to try to roll back tariffs, but for Republicans, they for a long time made it their duty to keep tariffs high so that they could protect businesses inside the United States, because that's what they liked. Jessica's got a question. Can I explain what the Pendleton Act was and what was its effects? Pendleton Act very simply is coming because James Garfield got assassinated by a crazy person who thought that he was going to become the ambassador to someplace amazing. So when Charles Guiteau helped James Garfield get elected, he wrote a letter that he never sent to anybody, and then he put it into his trunk, but he then became convinced that he was the person who helped James Garfield become president. And so he's the only assassin ever to go visit personally with the president before assassinating him. And he went to the White House, asked James Garfield to become the ambassador to someplace important. And when Garfield said no, then Guiteau decided he had to kill James Garfield instead of helping him get elected. When Guiteau kills Garfield, the thing that is scary is the fact that this guy, the assassin, was this close to possibly being an ambassador to someplace important, even though he was thoroughly crazy. So there's a push by some people in the Republican and Democratic parties to reform the spoils system with what's called the Pendleton Act. And all the Pendleton Act does is it gives people a civil service test for certain jobs in the United States government. So really important jobs that were given to like Grant's brother-in-law to run the Treasury or other sorts of things. Now you're going to need to pass a civil service test to prove that you're intelligent enough to understand enough about the government that you can do the basic minimal functions that are required for a job like the one that's out there. So the Pendleton Act isn't going to be a gigantic hurdle to leap over, but it does create a barrier for just wide open spoils system usage. And so it's one of our first reforms of the spoils system that we see during that time. Let me see here. Anna, your question is, what is realism? Realism is going to be contained in the video that I shared with you just a little bit ago, but the way to picture that movement is there is a movement in art to, instead of giving you like melodrama and like science fiction or transcendentalism or whatever, realism is a movement in literature and art to express the world as it actually is and show the gritty realness of society, especially during the Gilded Age, when you've got a good amount of corruption taking place inside of society. And so it's the idea of laying bare all of the reality rather than trying to sugarcoat it and making it into something that's a little bit more pleasing to the eye. Let me see here. Angela, what was the conflict between J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller, and why did Rockefeller have to give up his money? The big issue that's going on between J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller is somebody who is the dominant monopoly in the late 1800s. J.P. Morgan is going to be elevating himself in his monopoly structures in the late 1800s as well. And what you'll find is that John D. Rockefeller oftentimes has competition going on between many of them different monopolies, whether it's with Carnegie or Morgan or other sorts of individuals. But what Morgan is trying to do in the late 1800s is he's trying to figure out a way to transition away from one person running in a gigantic business. And instead what Morgan wants to do is creating his interlocking directorates, where he's got boards of directors on all these trusts, and Morgan wants to be the person behind the scenes kind of pulling the strings for all of those different monopolies. As far as why did Rockefeller have to give up his money, I'm a little bit confused about what you mean by that, because he ended up being one of the richest people ever in U.S. history and died that way. So if you can be more specific in your question, that might be helpful for me. As far as what are the key railroads to remember, the big railroads that are key: Union Pacific, Central Pacific creating the Transcontinental Railroad, and the Union Pacific working to create the scandal of the Credit Mobilier is another big one to know as well. Sometimes they'll ask about the Great Northern Railroad that didn't accept any sort of government funding, but that's more of a trivial thing than something that's absolutely necessary. So the Central and Union Pacifics are by far the most important, being the first transcontinentals that were created. I believe I'm done with period 4. I'm going to refresh to see if I have any more questions here, and I don't see any. So let me move on to period 5. Hallie's got a question. What are the names we need to know when it comes to the Gospel of Wealth? Carnegie is going to be the person who creates the Gospel of Wealth philosophy, and then many of the other monopoly owners during this time will adopt his views to demonstrate that they are being philanthropic or helping out society. All of the individuals you learn about as robber barons, though, are also going to be making lots of money for themselves and spending it lavishly. One of the weird stories about that is when Cornelius Vanderbilt died, he actually built a mausoleum in the center of a New York cemetery, and that mausoleum was the size of most people's houses. He also hired a guard service to work 24 hours, 7 days a week to sit outside of his tomb to make sure nobody stole his body or his family members' bodies. And when people afterwards questioned why he did that, they realized that the salary he was paying to those security guards was just a tiny little fraction of all the money he'd built up over his lifetime. And so it'd take hundreds of years for him to run out of cash, although I don't believe that the security guards are still on staff now. But for a number of years, they were outside guarding his tomb just because. And so for these guys, they've got plenty of cash to be able to work with, but they're also donating tons. And so, especially when it comes time to look for colleges and universities, you will probably find that some of these individuals who studied still have endowments and scholarships that are being granted currently that are spelling out still their continuation of the Gospel of Wealth. Matthew has a question. What is graft? And simply put, the way that graft works is, imagine I was running a political machine and I got a bunch of politicians put into government office. The way that I would work graft is I would already own a company like a construction company. And if there was something that needed to be built in our district, I would get the politicians that I got elected to hire me to be the one to build the building for them. And I would charge them this much to build the building, but then I would add in this much graft that I would be stealing from the government, and this would be the total bill that I would charge the government then. So I would charge them what the building actually cost, plus some money on the side for me so I could become personally wealthy and I could continue giving out gifts to immigrants who are coming to the country to continue having them participate in voting for my political machine. Let me see here. Do we need to, next question, do we need to know about the big four that sponsored the railroads? No, other than the fact that you've got individuals who are on the West Coast who are able to engineer the creation of the Central Pacific, it doesn't come up as a big issue to be able to pinpoint them individually. I find knowing the name Leland Stanford, though, for the Central Pacific Railroad is a good thing because he was the governor of California, helped run the Central Pacific Railroad, and then his building of Stanford University is a great example that you can use in your writing to be able to demonstrate an understanding of the Gospel of Wealth. So that's the reason why I hold that name together, because of all those elements that are in that spot. Meg's got a question, and the question is, what is the Populist Party? And the Populist Party, also known as the People's Party, is a farmers' party that is pushing for reforms in the political system to try to help out the farmers who are struggling, like you guys were when you were playing the farm game. When you think about the Populist Party, they are very much wanting to regulate railroads. They would like the government to get involved in busting up monopolies. They'd like to see a tax system that is more progressive than it is regressive. But in particular, what the populists are into is they're trying to figure out a way to inflate the money supply. And so what the farmers are mad about is that originally our money supply was gold. Then what happened during the Civil War is that Abe Lincoln started creating greenbacks. And the nice thing about having greenbacks and gold is it increases the amount of money that's floating around in circulation. When you think about the Steel Empire game that you played, though, you guys liked it when the prices dropped rather than staying high, because that then would help you to be able to build your monopoly more. So by adding greenbacks, Abraham Lincoln created inflation. So prices started going up because there was more money floating around, and things didn't become more valuable. It just took more dollars of these cheap greenbacks to be able to then buy stuff. And that made farmers happy for a while because the price of their food started going up. Part of the reason why the farmers are mad, though, is during the Grant presidency, many business owners are asking for Ulysses S. Grant and other Republicans to start taking greenbacks out of our circulation. And they start doing that. So our money supply starts dropping, making the price of everything cheaper, kind of like you saw with your food during our farm game. So here's what the farmers especially want. In the late 1800s, we start discovering a lot of silver. And what they want is they want to have us go to a bimetal system. So they would like us to have gold money and silver money and continue using greenbacks, with the hope that all of that would then inflate the money supply and help the economy then do better for farmers so they could make more cash and pay back their loans easier. When you read in this chapter, though, they talk to you about the Panic of 1893, and part of the reason why they have a Panic of 1893 is when the farmers create this law, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, they're going to create a rule that is going to be kind of weird. And what they're going to say is that one piece of gold is going to be equal to 16 pieces of silver in our new money system. Your problem, though, is we're going to be discovering a lot of silver with like the Comstock lode and other sorts of mining discoveries. And so in reality, 16 pieces of silver should not get you one piece of gold. It should actually take you like 30, 32, 40 pieces of silver to get one piece of gold. So when the Panic of 1893 hits, there's going to be a cycle that takes place where people are going to realize they can take their silver right here, trade in 16 pieces of silver for a greenback, and then turn around and trade that one greenback for gold. And that's why during the Panic of 1893 in chapter 23, you see the country almost go bankrupt and run out of gold because people keep cashing in all of their silver and their greenbacks to get gold that is incredibly underpriced during this time period. So you're going to have a crash economically, and also we're going to lose all of our gold while still being on the gold standard, and that's going to really blow up our economy badly, and it's going to make the Panic of 1893 really nasty and bad. Hopefully that helps. If you've got other questions, feel free to follow up so I can back them up with you. The next question, though, that I see from Meg is, can I explain the Credit Mobilier scandal? The Credit Mobilier is going to be something that when you learn about it in French class or other classes, you'll hear it pronounced right, Credit Mobilier. But the Credit Mobilier for us Americans is very simple. You've got the Union Pacific Railroad that is building a transcontinental railroad out west. In Congress, the Congress desperately wants this railroad to be built. And so if you remember, the Congress is sending both land and money to the Union Pacific Railroad as a gift and an incentive for them to build the railroad up. So you've got land and money going to the railroad. And what the Union Pacific is going to do is they're going to give a gift of stock to every member in Congress. Now, the problem with the stock gift is suddenly you now have people in Congress owning the same business that they are now providing payment to for doing stuff for the government. So the big question when you look at this, is the stock gift equal to a bribe? And most of us would recognize that it is. They're bribing Congress to get them to do what they want. The thing that's going to happen then in this process is after the gift of stock is delivered, the Union Pacific is going to tell Congress that the railroad is too hard to build on their own and they need to hire a second company, the Credit Mobilier, to be the ones to help build the rest of the railroad for them. And Congress is going to say, yes, we're going to give land and money to the Credit Mobilier company as well. But what people in the public don't realize is that the Credit Mobilier is not a real company, and all of those gifts that are being given are just being shipped straight up to the Union Pacific Railroad. And the profits from that deal are going to Congress as well because the value of their stock is going up. So this scandal is one of many different scandals happening during the Grant presidency. And Kaylee's got a question, what were the biggest faults of Grant during his time period? He's got tons of scandals happening in both Congress and the presidency during his time in office, and there isn't any evidence that he was directly involved in all of these schemes. But while he's president, you have the gold scheme. You have a whiskey ring where people who are supposed to be collecting taxes are getting bribed not to collect taxes. You've got this scheme. You've got an Indian land sales scheme where people are trying to sell Indian land for trading posts and doing so illegally. And whenever Grant's people get caught who are involved in the spoil system, Grant always comes forward and forgives them and gives them an out, so they never get punished for all this illegal behavior that they're in his presidency. So that's the Credit Mobilier, and that's also the criticism that Grant receives. Grant is somebody who's a really nice guy, great general during the Civil War. Fantastic that he created the Force Act to try to root out the KKK. Sadly, it happened a little bit too late, but he is somebody who has got corruption like crazy inside of his White House, and it's really bad. Let me see here. Ian has a question. Can I explain the Hayes versus Tilden issue? And definitely. So the way to think about the Hayes versus Tilden issue is in the election of 1876, Southern Redeemers have done their damage. So in states like Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, you've got now attempts being made to prevent African Americans from voting freely. You've also got some rigging of elections taking place by Democrats in the South. And so what's going to be happening is in these elections, you're going to get two very different results. And so the Republicans will claim that they win these states in the election of 1876, but because of Democratic vote counting in these southern states, the Democrats are going to claim that they won the elections in those three states. And it takes those three states to give somebody the majority of the electoral votes to win the presidency in 1876. So the battle is going to go from them to a congressional committee, and the committee is set up so there's one more Republican than Democrats, and they split along party lines. And so we're about to choose a president by choosing him based on the vote of one person in Congress who we already know what his vote was going to be because of the party that he was in. So you're on the verge of a gigantic split if we just have to accept those results. The Democratic Party, though, is going to come forward to Rutherford B. Hayes with a deal. And the deal that they're going to offer is to give in on the election of 1866, to not challenge it or fight the results or anything. The Republican Rutherford B. Hayes will become president with the promise that he's going to end military reconstruction at that moment. And with Hayes, he is going to agree because at that point, you guys remember from your Steel Empire game, you're in the Panic of 1873. The economy is tanking. Out in Little Bighorn, you've got a defeat of George Custer by Native Americans out in the Montana region. You've also got a problem going on with strikes that are happening in 1876, 1877. So the idea of taking the troops out of the South and moving them north or west seems really appealing at that time. So that's the way that the Compromise of 1877 is going to work out. Hayes becomes president. Military reconstruction is going to end. Lou's got a question. Could I explain the Credit Mobilier and the issue with silver? I hope I did both of those well enough for you. But especially when you think about the silver versus gold debate, the big issue that you have right here is when you think about what they do, they set up a 16-to-1 silver ratio where this trade-in ratio, when they start discovering more silver, it should really be floating up and down. So the more silver they find should make it then less scarce, and it should take more silver to get one piece of gold. When they don't do that and the panic starts happening, people start hoarding gold like crazy, yanking it out of our banking system and almost collapsing our economy in 1893. Let me see here. Nikolai, the question, what key ideas contributed to the limited success of the AFL in the early stages, and how did it gain traction to become the largest labor union by 1900? The big thing that it's struggling with is the idea that it's only trying to represent skilled workers, which is going to make it easier for them to negotiate, but it's also going to be harder for them to gain traction and build up a large union base if they're only accepting skilled workers. The other problem that every union is going to run into is unions are going to really struggle when there are economic downturns, especially around the Panic of 1893, where it's really hard to have a strong union when you've got a bunch of unemployed people who are willing to work for pennies on the dollar because they've got no money coming in. And so as a result, unions oftentimes will struggle during times that are economically bad. The AFL from 1900 forward, though, is going to benefit from the fact that it's still in existence. It's got a stable base. It's been around for a while. And when we get to 1900, you're going to have Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, three progressive presidents who are friendly to labor unions rather than being unfriendly like the presidents of the Gilded Age were. Let me see here. That's all I see for period 6. Let me refresh. Let me see if I got any other questions. Oh, Trina's got a question as far as what's going on with the McKinley tariff. How did the McKinley tariff get passed since it was so high? The reason why the tariff was passed was precisely because it was high. And so the way to think about that tariff is when you have panics going on and economic problems that are taking place and businesses are nervous. We just made it through the Panic of 1883. We're coming up the Panic of 1893. And so the McKinley tariff was built with the idea that if we could create the taxes on our borders to such a high level that Europeans can't come in, what'll happen then is that if Americans want stuff, they'll have to buy it from American companies. American companies will then have to hire American workers. So their feeling back then was the idea that high tariffs would then protect our country because we have such a big market from East Coast to West Coast that we've got plenty of buyers, and if they can only buy American, then our businesses and jobs are going to stay safe. When you think about a tariff, though, it's what's known as a regressive tariff. So when you ask what is a progressive and a regressive tax, a regressive tax is one that is felt with more pain by people who are poorer in our society. So when you think about a tax like a tariff, if a tariff is put onto a product, like let's say this Sharpie comes into America and we add like a 5-cent tariff to this Sharpie, paying 5 cents is a lot harder for somebody who's in deep poverty than it is for a multimillionaire. And so when you find that tax, while the price is the same, it's going to be harder for somebody who's poorer who has less money than somebody who is wealthier. So with a tariff is oftentimes seen as a regressive tax where it's going to affect poorer people more. On the other hand, a progressive tax would be one that is set up to tax rich people more based on the idea that because of their wealth, an increase in taxes that are charged will still not feel as bad because what they'll be cutting into is not necessities for life, but instead extras when compared to somebody who is poor. So a progressive income tax might be one where poor people pay a lower rate and rich people pay a higher rate in order to be able to fund the government, but also to try to spread out the pain so that poor people aren't the ones who are paying the burden for a higher tax. Hopefully that helps out. If that's still confusing, we can definitely go into that more, and I do not anticipate that will be a gigantic portion of the test that you've got going on for tomorrow. Let me take a look and see if I've got any other questions that have been posted. Otherwise, we'll wrap up for tonight. I do not see any more questions. Good luck tonight. Make sure that if you have any questions, you email or you come see me sometime tomorrow. Also, congratulations, last multiple choice test of the semester. You guys are done with the most difficult early American history stuff. And as we move into second semester and we start moving to more recent times, you'll see stuff looking even more and more relevant and modern, which has me pretty excited about transitioning to that point. Good luck tonight, and then we'll talk tomorrow about review strategies for your final. Have a good night.